All right, now that we have that fake data library generated, we can go ahead and actually start implementing some Selenium code to utilize it. So let's go ahead and get started actually writing some cool Selenium stuff. So I need a few imports from the Selenium library. I need the builder class and the by class, which is their way of locating elements. We have some very DOM manipulation, esque utilities that we can use to find elements and interact with them on the page. And I'm going to import our data library. What else? .env. And the reason why I am utilizing .env is because I've abstracted out the URL of the form to an environment variable, just so I don't have it show up in the source code, because I just want to make sure that nobody inadvertently stumbles upon that URL. Even though I know that most people in this video probably would use it as a form to test out Selenium and do some anti-spamming, countermeasures, but I'd still rather not run the risk of an innocent party encountering it. So we have .env in here just to have that abstracted out. I also will be blurring part of this video to hide the URL bar, and it's for that reason that I actually have to try out some window management of the Selenium instance itself. So for some inexplicable reason, it just starts at like a randomized position everywhere. So we'll have to have some code make our Selenium window start, here and run the width of the size of the screen. So with Selenium, virtually everything is asynchronous. So we have an async function main that we're going to execute. And yeah, we need to try instantiating our Selenium instance. So we'll set up a try catch block. We'll log out our error, and we'll just nuke the process from orbit. So we'll just kill it in the event we encounter an error. You can make yours a lot more resilient than this. I'm just trying to do a lightweight example emulating what I did previously, so that way you might have some inspiration as for how you could maybe make this generate fake data for your application. You might have some good positive purposes out of this. So maybe you just want a script to run and fill up your data with, legitimate seeming fake data. So we're going to create a new instance of the builder class, and we have to specify for which browser this Selenium instance is going to be. So I'm going to do Firefox just because that's what I typically use. And I need to go ahead and build it. So like I said, it's going to open itself in a random position. And so I do need to make it resize just so I can blur the top part of this video safely, and I don't run the risk of having it accidentally get exposed for like a half second that I don't notice upon editing this. So say driver.manage. So this is us actually trying to physically manipulate like the window object itself. And I have this function setRect, which takes an option object as TypeScript is indicating for the x, y, width, and height. So we'll say which coordinates, so 0, 0 to start in the top left corner, and then the width and the height. And let's see, I need to tell the window to go ahead and launch and grab that URL. So we'll go ahead and say driver.get, and then we'll pass in process.env.url. And it doesn't know that that might be defined, so this could be a string, it could be undefined. TypeScript is just saying like, hey, do that. I could use some safer code and just say, like, if it's not defined, throw an error. And so I'll just say Andrew broke the URL. So there we go. We actually now have URL safely typed, since TypeScript was saying, hey, it's either going to be a string or undefined. Well, if it's throwing an error, if it's undefined, that must mean that this type is a truthy, value. It's a string. So we were able to get that safely evaluated. And I am a proponent of testing, frequently. So let's go ahead and make sure this code executes. So I do have, a dev script here, and I'm utilizing NodeMon with type, or with TS Node. So if you have TS Node as part of your dependencies or your dev dependencies, you can just get NodeMon to live execute TypeScript files without any additional config, which is pretty cool. So I'm running npm run dev. We should see the window pop up. We should see it reposition itself, and then maybe I did have the wrong URL. Let's go reevaluate that. Maybe I had a secondary environment variable that I need to adjust. Perhaps I should try, instead of URL, some form URL variable. And now this actually will go ahead and execute the form. So we have pulled up the form, and it's pretty crappy. So as well tailored as the email campaign may have been, this pretty much should have set off red flags for most people, but most doesn't mean all. And given that when I looked at the email headers, it seemed to actually have been from an internal within their organization person forwarding it. It seems like someone did fall victim to that, and they had their email compromised. Maybe they didn't necessarily submit this form, but they may have clicked on some kind of malicious link to get their Outlook credentials compromised, and it propagated this. So but still, the chances are non-zero that somebody actually did fall a legitimate victim to this. So looking at the form itself, I mean, it's pretty bad. Pixelated, just bad grammar all over the place, random capitalization and horrible spacing, red flags galore. But the thing I care about is these inputs. And so I want to find all of these inputs utilizing Selenium. So Selenium does not have a selector for elements by tag names. You can use IDs, you can use class names, you can use XPaths, and you can use CSS selectors. So I tend to utilize those if I'm not finding something by an ID, just because they're going to be the same exact CSS selector as you would utilize with a query selector. So typically my approach when I am utilizing Selenium is I will just open up my dev console in my Selenium window and just do some live testing with some query selectors to see what I get. So we might think that trying to get a query selector just matching the input tag would be, a hit, because we just have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-ish inputs. But that actually isn't the case. This form has a bunch of hidden inputs all over it. So that can kind of throw a wrench in the gears. So if I try to do a query selector all for the input tag, 23 useless ones. However, just because I've done this a couple times, I know that the inputs that I'm looking for all have the type of text. That's the way I can look out and specifically target each one of these, including, the email and the password. This is not type email, this is not type text. They are all, or type password, they are all just type text. So we can modify our query selector a little bit to say hey, let's look for inputs with the attribute of type equaling text. And that actually gets us our 9 inputs. So I can actually just go copy paste this CSS selector and have Selenium use a CSS selector of its own to grab those exact same elements. So I can say const inputs is equal to await, and then in order to select elements with Selenium, I'll say driver.find elements plural. So this effectively is acting as like query selector all, as opposed to find element, which would be like query selector, singular. We can specify by, and we're using that, by class, which has a bunch of like child methods that allow us to search for some very specific properties. So like I said, name link text, that's actually not one that I've utilized before, but that could be really handy. ID, JS, but most of the time it's going to be CSS or ID for me. And it might not be the most performant, I could make something a little more targeted. However, I like it because it's very easy and convenient to do a query selector all and just translate that directly over into Selenium code, because I know that these 9 elements that I've found are going to be the same exact 9 elements I'm referencing in my inputs. I want to manage each one of these inputs independently, and I could do like 9 or so lines of code and say like const yes no input equals inputs at index position 0, or I could just array destructure them all since it will return them in the same order. So instead of writing like 9 garbage lines of code, I'm going to write like 1. So we have a yes no input. Full name, the alternate university name, alternate university email. Okay, so that's yes no. Full name, alt uni name, alt uni email, alt uni password follows suit with that, then alt uni phone number. Let's see, name, email, password, phone associated with that. And then this is the Jefferson State, the main email. So we have the main email, main password, main phone. All right. So in order to send data into one of these forms, which I guess I need to kill my dev script for the time being, because every time I save, it's going to relaunch my server. So let me shut this down temporarily. So I wanted to go on a little tangent about promises and the abuse of asynchronous code. So with Selenium, pretty much everything is asynchronous. So you have to await a lot of lines individually. As far as filling out these individual inputs, I don't need those to happen in a synchronous fashion. And so this is an abuse of await that I see so much, not just, from beginner developers, but from established mid-level developers and even higher. I see it all the time on Reddit or even Medium or YouTube, and it drives me absolutely bonkers. But if I were to write code that was like await yes no dot send keys, this types in the input the string hello world. If that theoretically took 2 or 3 or 4 seconds to resolve, well, if we do that for every one of these inputs, we are awaiting the resolution of the previous promise, before executing the next one. And all of a sudden, you just turned like a 4-second process into like a 36-second process. Like, you almost force synchronicity with your code that way. And so you should be utilizing promise.all or promise.all_settled in these instances, because I don't care about the order in which these fill out. I just need to kick off the process, and I need to be notified upon when they all end up resolving. Now, in this instance, I am actually just going to use promise.all. You might want to use promise.all_settled if you are tolerant of a promise rejecting. In this instance, if a promise fails, virtually everything has to go correctly with this form. Like, there are no optional elements, and so if I skip an input, if I fail to populate an input, I just can't, so you could make it a little more, tolerant, but I can't submit this specific form as is with, missing data. So it's for that reason that I'm just going to go ahead and utilize promise.all. So promise.all just takes an array of promises, and it will resolve once every one of the individual ones do. Like I was saying, if an error gets thrown, well, it throws an error, and that's kind of the end of it. Promise.all_settled will resolve once all of the individual promises have either resolved or rejected, and you can do some kind of, I don't know, you can see if their status is rejected and maybe attempt to refill out a form. It's just such a super dependent thing, but in this instance, like I said, I'm just doing a very superficially kind of quick, demo of what I utilized. So we're just going to be filling out this array with a bunch of promises. And this is where we are going to be integrating that super awesome library that we made. So with this, I've obviously crapped up all the data a lot already. So even though this isn't the greatest, and I'm assuming, it's always going to have an alternate university, we can still have some fun with filling this out, even though it's not going to be as accurate as my initial run was. So, I need to construct my user object first. All right, so user.first. User.last. All right, that's our full name. Our alt university name is gonna be user.altschool. And the names, that's an array of names that the school has, both like the official and like some shortcutted common variants. So I need to get that little helper function get random from. So that's going to let me get a random school name from that array of names. And so for that email, it's going to be in that email object for that alt property. Let's see, alt user password. It's going to be, or alt uni password. User.password.alt. Let's see, the next up is the alt uni phone. Send keys. User.phone.alt. And we kind of have the last three, which are a repeat of kind of the previous three, just with main substituted for alt. And since I structured the email, password, and phone objects just to mirror that structure, we can actually just do some quick Control D action. Well, I named the variable main and not main uni. But did I name that main pass instead of main password? Shame on me, I named that password. I should have stayed a little more consistent with that. So this alone, this is going to fill out most of the inputs. We do have a couple more that we have to handle. So let's launch up that window so we can do a little more inspection and see what else we have to find. There's a checkbox we have to check because, obviously, a checkbox makes everything fully legitimate, right? So, we have our fake data filling out here. It happened pretty quickly, which is nice because it's really effective and efficient. And it's generating the fake but legitimate looking, emails and some local phone numbers. And it's utilizing, one of the top 10,000 breached passwords. So that gives it some air of legitimacy as well. So we need to also click this. This is also one of their required inputs. And we actually have a div with an ID that we can target. So like I said, I usually use query selectors and use the by CSS locator, but if I can find something by an ID, I'm going to use that. And this has been I42 as the ID, and it's been that way for a couple weeks. So like, I'll keep using that. And so we'll say, all right, well, const checkbox is await driver.find element singular by dot ID I42. That finds the checkbox. And the checkbox is also kind of like these inputs. I don't really care when one of these finishes. I just care when they all collectively finish. So, we start the process of kicking off each individual promise. But like I was saying earlier, if these take like 4 seconds to resolve, maybe there's some like networking delay or something. Yeah, I don't know, but assuming there was some kind of delay that we kind of artificially induced, well, that's really of no concern here because we are not caring about when a specific one resolves, just when they all collectively have resolved. So, and here it's a checkbox, so we're not sending any like keys to it, we're not typing in it, we're just clicking on it. But once all of these have resolved, we can actually go ahead and click that submit button. And you should also click that subscribe button if you haven't done so yet. But as far as the submit button goes, we can look for a div with the role of button. And we actually have a few elements that match that. So we have 3 buttons, or 3 divs with the role of button, this submit button, this clear form button, and this little info button. So we can use our query selector here. And we'll look for divs with the property role equaling button. So that gets us 3, but we can see that the first one in that node list is just this submit button. So we can just use a query selector to return that. And for me, that equivalent is going to be, driver find element singular, just to get the first item for whatever their node list returns. So I can say const submit button. And this is why I really like using query selector all, just because it's a great way of testing it out, and I can just paste that exact CSS selector directly in here. So it works out really, really nicely. So once all of the individual inputs themselves have collectively finished resolving, then I can go ahead and click the submit button. Now the beautiful part about this code is, and let me compartmentalize this into a function too, by the way. Let's see. Fillet, I don't know. Seems to be an asynchronous function. So I'm just moving like all of our true like DOM scraping and data generation into a function called fillet that, I'll invoke once, and this will come back into play very, very shortly. But upon us clicking submit, there's something that makes it really, really easy to spam this with a bunch of data. So we click submit, and on the page here, it just filled everything out, hit submit. We have submit another response available to us as a clickable link. So this is just an anchor tag, and it's the only one on the page or on this conditional render. So I can, after this, use Selenium to go find that and click it. So driver.findElement by CSS. So this is going to return just the first element it finds. So I'm using a query selector, this CSS selector, for just anchor tags, and we've found one, and then we can just click it. So I'll call that redo, and I'll say await redo.click. Now this gets us to a really, really cool point, because if all of the functionality of running through this DOM manipulation exists inside of that function, and I just had that click the go back button, could we not just invoke the function within itself infinitely? And that's all I needed to do. And yes, that's pretty much how I had it executing initially. So upon successfully going through everything and clicking the redo button, I just have the function fill itself out. And so all of the main construction of the instance of the driver, that stays outside of the scope of the function. And I did that because that takes a little while to build up, like maybe 10 or so seconds, in addition to fetching the web page. Whereas this is actually still the same web page, it's just kind of conditionally rendering two separate parts of it. So we save ourselves a ton of time by leaving that out the function. And so this just means for every iteration of the function loop, we generate a new user object and then grab the inputs and fill everything out. And so on average, it's just like a couple of seconds per fake data submission. But I mean, we can see it's kind of just flying through everything here. And you can see the window bouncing up and down because we're using promise.all. We're not saying, hey, 1 has to finish resolving before we can start with 2. It just says whatever completes first, completes first. So it kind of fills in everything all over the place. It's kind of addicting to just watch. You just kind of zone out and let it rip for a little while. But yeah, so let me go ahead and kill our server. And like I was saying, this is kind of time-wise the expensive part of Selenium if you're trying to automate some stuff. So really, I just want to repeat the most bare minimum if I can. And so I do have to create a brand new user object. And since I do have different pages, I do need to refine the elements, and I do need to send out, all of the randomized data, and then go through the usual process. But it's really not too terribly much. And at the end, upon successfully going through everything and clicking the redo button, the pure filling function just reinvokes itself. And so as long as I have this line of code in here, that would run infinitely. But that's about it. And if you have any questions about Selenium, y'all go ahead and drop them in the comments. Maybe that gives us some ideas for future videos. Or if you have some suggestions already for a future video, we'd love to hear those. So go ahead and subscribe, and thanks for watching.